Stars were pitched into an orbit to light their way. There was a rhythm in how the darkness ducked and skirted the whipping flares, an ebb and flow as it seeped out from and then drained back into the joints and crevices of the corridor's stone walls. Each pass of a star carved a vignette of their progress out of the shadows. Past the lintel was a landing, and then a corridor to one side. The ratio of the passage was square, and only the murder holes spaced overhead just shy of every 10th pace differentiated the ceiling from the floor. Dust was strung in every corner, and in the guides for the portcullis still rigged overhead. The corridor maintained the lightest lean that suggested not a straight path, but a curve around something. Each pace against the stone floor echoed through the distance too vast to explore. There was a gristle underfoot from a fine layer of sand. Their rasping breath stole what they could from the cold air, but even these stopped when they came across a slicked print from blood-slathered fingers. It was a graffiti mess of clawing, scraping, and begging, stains uncomfortably akin to the curse that raked inside Cassandra, almost proof to the sensation. That evidence of seeking and clasping suggested a presence, an overwhelming need lurking in the darkness ahead, and Cassandra could not approach it. The stars she had conjured began to dim, content with what had been seen and unwilling to further expose the unknown, unwilling to expose her to whatever was waiting, wanting, claiming. "Snap out of it," Nisu growled. He took the lead, usurping her lights and fueling them with the intensity of his own personality. The added detail was gruesome and unnecessary in a hallway already haunted with their doubts. The prints on the wall grew wider, soon stroked too broad to be a hand alone. They scrawled along the walls, then drained into dry puddles on the floor. Cassandra hitched up her robe and skirt to watch as her feet danced around the stains. Another set of portcullis grooves partitioned the corridor. The architects had been a paranoid people, convinced that they could withstand a siege even if someone had penetrated this deeply into their keep. While the first portcullis was still seated in the ceiling, the second had been dropped, but then had failed its purpose. The beams had been rent into splinters by something with a strength Tarkhan could hardly imagine, even given how well versed he was with the game of his mother's hunts. The blood that once stained the walls was now a stain streaming across the floor, draining around the bend to a curious patch not quite discernible in the distance. As the light approached, they could see staircases. The ascending was scattered and dribbled with brown specks. The descending was washed with old blood. "We should split up," Tarkhan said. A blunt end beat Tarkhan upside the head, arousing the throbbing he had happily stilled. "What kind of idiot are you?" Nicken fumed. "Split up? Do you see the paintings on the walls? Does that look like art to you? Put your brain back together. We should split up indeed." "Nicken," Nesu interrupted. "You are a gamesman. What is the better route?" "Keep back those damned lights," Nicken ordered. He trusted his eyes in the darkness and knelt beside each print to examine them more closely. "The trail downstairs is the fresher of the two, and there are lights at the base of the stairs. You would have seen it if you would only have killed those flares." Nesu had begun his descent by the time Narikon quipped, "All right, down we go," in order to muster his courage. The stairway was straight, and the slope was shallow, and the last steps were illuminated from the darkness by an ambient orange glow emanating from the room beyond. Their descent of the wide steps was slowed by apprehension. They hung close to the walls to avoid slipping. The stairs were worn from excessive traffic, and the polished dip at the center of each step's lip served to collect and drain the blood down the entire flight. Nesu extinguished the swirling stars, blanketing everyone in shadows. They crept to the last step, out of the darkness and into the ambient orange glow. The landing at the base of the stairs opened to the ambulatory of a rotunda. Beyond the columns of the circumventing aisle, torches illuminated a towering subterranean dome. "What is this place?" Cassandra asked. "I am not certain," Nesu replied. They crossed between the pillars and into the central dome. The floor was cobbled in concentric rings which culminated at a stone well. It was full to cresting. Ripples locked in time against expanding any further were stunned across the surface. Droplets, suspended between gravity and sequence, drew their gaze up the curve to the apex of the dome. A black iron chain, crusted with orange rust, was strung from the peak. A body, caked with blood, was the pendulum cuffed at the end of the chain. Droplets were forming at his fingertips, anxious for their turn to rain into the pool below. His knuckles and palms were washed in blood. Sanguine rivulets forked and coursed round the muscles strapping his arms and shoulders, and cascaded the contours of his stomach like rapids over rocks. Blood was pooled in the sockets of his groin, from which one unfettered leg, ghastly pale, hung limp to the side. The other leg, by which he was suspended, was traced with trickles. Around his ankle was clapped the iron cuff. There was blood between his toes. This was a palace of nightmares, and the body slung upside down from the vault was its grotesque chandelier. This was too easy. But did she expect the Redcaps to make it difficult? There he was, his name almost inexpressible, almost unidentifiable, in hopes that he might be somewhere, anywhere else. It was the auburn curls of the beard, however, which gave him away, his mousy face, despite its flush, that confirmed her fear. He drooled blood, wept blood. It sweat across his brow to mat and stain dark his once auburn bangs. Doubt could not damn her recognition of his face, and the display's virulence cracked in her just as her voice cracked when she next cried. "Draco!" "What is this?" These were the only words that could penetrate Tarakon's bewilderment. Nesu swept for further evidence of the Redcap's sadism, but there were no other tools or fetters, only the columns and vaults of the ambulatory. "It is some kind of cistern," Nesu hissed as he approached the basin. "This was once a well, perhaps a spring or cenote or oasis. There was once water here. They had built a well." "Who is they?" "I do not know, but this is why they were so defensive of the keep. Its cistern housed a stable source of water in the desert. No matter who attempted a siege, unless they penetrated the entire keep, they would eventually have to retreat for lack of water." Nesu paused as he soaked his imagination in the contents of the well. "If the well dried up, however, the entire population in the castle would be damned." He mused with a quieter remorse. "The Redcaps were trying to fill the well." "With blood?" Cassandra recoiled with pity at the dementia. "Is he alive?" Nicken pondered aloud. They all looked up, past the droplets raining down from above to the corpse strung a story above them. "I mean, if he bleeds." "We will not know whether or not he is alive until we bridge the next moment," Tarakon reminded. "By the Tawesh," Cassandra swore. "Nothing rash." Nesu cut off the princess's fueling imagination. "If he is, then we are about to put ourselves in a very dangerous position." "How do we get him down?" Cassandra demanded. There were no hypotheticals for her here. "I will remove the chain from the hook," Nesu started. "Tarakon, you will have to carry him." His tone was becoming more rushed. "We will just head back the way we came as quickly as possible." Without an alternative, it was impossible to object. "All right, let's go," Tarakon hyped, stretching his muscles in preparation for the weight he would bear. Nesu stared into the vault and discerned his goal. He took a deep, concentrated breath and held it. Its effervescence seeped through his blood slowly, loaning a sense of detachment to him in patches. The equilibrium of the densities between his mass and air was misconstrued. While the air around him grew thick and tangible, he, in contrast, began to decompress. Drafts stole into the spaces between his toes and slipped beneath the arches of his soles to usurp him, to repel him toward depths less dense. Nesu was buoyant. The trait permeated him entirely, even causing his cloak to drift in the air. He floated toward the apex of the dome, swimming up toward a surface unseen. The cloak plumed and billowed as he slowed and bobbed within arm's reach of the chain. He attempted to warn them, but his words were garbled and dull, spoken in a register so low they were almost inaudible. He reached out. His fingers traced the link looped around the hook. The red droplets suspended against time dropped and popped apart, sending ripples across the surface of the blood-flooded well. The once uniform glow of the cellar suddenly wavered as sconces flickered rather than shone. The tumble into the next moment disoriented and startled everyone except Nesu. They spun around, afraid of what it was that lurked behind them, but found only their own torch-cast shadows dancing in the ambulatory to the mournful droning that wept in echoes down the stairs. Nasu was strong, but as Flotsam he was not strong enough to bear the weight of Draco. Nasu pressed his hand to the chain to imbue it with the same imbalance that had lifted him into the air. Link by link it seeped through the chain and into the body of the prince. In the restored current of time, it was clear that the prince was still alive. The deep gashes torn across his soul poured rivulets of fresh blood down his leg to coagulate and cake across his body. As the ambivalence to gravity settled into the prince, his blood, too, slipped out of Waite's grasp. The droplets that clung to his fingertips heaved suddenly back, almost with regret for risking such a high dive. Threads of red film slunk into the air, swirling and swimming like Nasu's robes into a cloud around Draco's body. Finally, the chain could be lifted. Nasu heaved it off of the hook and reeled in the prince's body. Cradling Draco, Nasu exhaled slowly, and with each measure of breath exhaled, they sank lower and lower. The surface of the pool of blood grew still. The viscous, sanguine pool was quick to absorb the shock of the strikes that had rained down on it for days. The surface settled into what appeared as an almost opaque sheet of crimson glass. The toe of Nasu's shoe had only barely scraped the floor when the still pond of blood suddenly warbled and splashed. Still exhaling his descent, Nasu choked on a gasp as he saw a redcap crest the fill in the well. It blinked off the blood that momentarily blinded its eyes, then investigated the vacant vault while sanguine streams dribbled from its chin. Its outraged squawk echoed through the cistern as it noticed the plundered body, and the witches and warriors gathered around its tub. Terracon turned on his heel to make a hack with his axe, but caught only splashing blood on the razor's edge. Scarlet drippings splattered the floor under the arc of the redcap's leap. Nicken's eyes had caught the redcap's flight and predicted the spot where it would land. Too far to catch up on his short legs, he held his spear with both hands over his shoulder and made a very short dash. The spear's tip was dropped in the seam between two cobbles, and another step bowed the spear, and then it recoiled and launched the dwarf into a spring that matched the redcap's in height and distance. In descent, however, the dwarf landed with far more finesse. The sopping feet of the redcap lost traction on the cobblestone floor, and slipped and scampered through a fumbled landing. Nicken, with his spear still in hand, practically danced. The tip of the weapon was whisked ahead so fast that it faded into an arcing silver streak that crashed to spark the cobblestone floor, fractions of measures short of the redcap. The dwarf cursed, but at least he was now in range. After steadying itself, the redcap scanned them all quickly to spot Draco's body. Nicken was in the way, teasing at it with his spear. Its agile dives and feints, however, kept Nicken from landing a strike. One feint gave it the space to rear its next pounce. Nicken's next jab drove straight toward the redcap, but undershot the goblin's leap. Nasu had caught his breath and had passed Draco's body onto Terracon. With his attention now spared, he turned to strike at the redcap, but the opportunity was wrenched from his grasps by Cassandra. Her claw was already at the redcap's heart, quieting its frenzied pulse in her distant, constrictive grip. It had been caught mid-flight, was seized by and clenched with invisible pains. Every muscle cramped, choking off its dying screams. The body heaved for only a moment more, then the cramping muscles gave way. Limp in the air, Cassandra discarded it to the ground, her compassion ambivalent to its grave. "Make haste," Nasu growled, then stole to the front of their escape. He cast some new flares into orbit, then scaled the stairs with wide strides. If not for the bitter complaints of Nicken pulling up the rear, Cassandra would have ignited her own set of stars again. Instead, she pushed Terracon on, apologizing and crutching him up whenever her spurring caused him to trip and falter under her brother's bulk. Terracon swore at her between his gritted teeth in his best effort to defend his racing after the vizier. "Quickly!" Nasu's badgering failed to drive Terracon any faster. His knees and thighs smoldered ash-hot from high stepping with Draco stacked on his back. Terracon gasped desperately as he reached the last step. He pinned Draco between his shoulder and the wall to distribute the weight and crutch himself as his knees broke beneath him. "Come on!" Nasu summoned with a timbre violent enough to make up for the minimal volume. Cassandra begged Terracon to keep pace. Nicken passed them both up. "Just a minute," he panted. "I can make it. Just a—" Nasu screamed from down the hall. Cassandra called out to and chased after the vizier. Nicken ran back toward Terracon. past him, and started up the blood-speckled stairs. "Nicken, wait! What happened?" "They are dropping down the murder holes!" The dwarf's voice echoed in the stairwell. Cassandra came around the bend in time to see Nesu hurl a red cap from his shoulder. The vizier's panic overwhelmed his pride, and he defensively raised a hand to steady his concentration on a target. The orbs of light that had lit their way hurled themselves at the redcaps, blasting apart with great concussive explosions that battered and deterred, if only momentarily, the redcaps' advance. Cassandra was caught off guard by the rebuking fury Nesu could conjure in his glare, despite his eyes already being swollen with fear. "Back!" he snapped. When she did not retreat with favorable reflex, he stole her wrist in his fist and towed her behind. With Nesu's star spent, Cassandra conjured up a light, and by its glow could Tenebra's silhouettes be seen raking their way out of the plume of smoke and dust that congested the corridor. Echoes of shrill screams taunted and teased at their ears. It was a disturbing cacophony because Cassandra knew that sound. It was not foreign, but quite familiar, hauntingly familiar. Human sounds, human voices, human howls that begged and pleaded, but were utterly out of context in the mouths of the redcaps who seemed to use them for war cries. "Damn it!" Nesu spat, then threw Cassandra against the wall. A magnificent gesture installed Nesu's will into a redcap, who had dropped through a murder hole before them to block their path. Overcome with the indecision loaned by Nesu, the redcap leapt past them and into the billowing smoke. Nesu snatched at Cassandra once more, threw her head down the hall, then turned back toward the calamity. He clutched the beams of a portcullis several paces behind them and violently tore it from the rigging in the next story up. The grill chattered as it slid through the stone sleeve and coughed up dust from where it loudly crashed. "Farther!" Nesu cried as he turned to find Cassandra still too close by his side. "You have sealed us in here, and pray bought us just one more moment." "Where are you going now?" Tarakan shouted as they passed him and started up the stairs. "Come on," Nesu ordered. Tarakan gasped at the prospect of more stairs. The shaft was narrow and steep compared to the previous flight, and agitated further Tarakan's burning gait. The flight was, however, shorter, and its top landing broke off in two directions. "A window!" Nicken shouted from the front of the line. As the others ascended to the landing, they could see the lancet from the room past one door, and could hear through the other the echoed hooting and hollering emanating from the depths of a darkened corridor. "This way!" The dwarf beckoned them toward the window.